Ok, doamnelor și domnilor, ladies and gentlemen, bine ați venit la încă o conferință făcută de Asociația Ține de Noi în cooperare cu Center for Early Conflict Warning. Ne bucurăm astăzi să atacăm între ghilimele un subiect deosebit, care ar putea fi rezumat cam așa. Cum va arăta securitatea europeană și, pe cale de consecință, securitatea noastră, după ce Marea Britanie va părăsi Uniunea Europeană, după ce se va întâmpla Brexitul. Știți că e o problemă care a fost viu disputată, a fost după aia îndelung amânată, urmează să se tranșeze. Sunt alegeri mâine în Marea Britanie, a fost și reuniunea NATO de la Londra, sunt lucruri care se înlănțuie foarte meticulos și vor avea o finalitate destul de urgentă, destul de rapidă. De asta ne bucurăm că suntem împreună, nu o să fac o introducere prea lungă, alta decât să spun că atunci când avem, de exemplu, teritoriul național supravegheat îndeaproape de avioane rusești, de exemplu, în momentul de față nu sunt nici avioane germane, nici avioane franceze care se ridică, sunt avioane NATO. Sunt avioane britanice uneori, alteori sunt avioane americane, uneori sunt avioanele noastre, tot avioane americane, care se ridică atunci când e nevoie. Ne preocupă poziția Marii Britanii și care va fi privirea ei asupra noi arhitecturi de securitate europeană. Ne preocupă în directă linie. Vreau să-i dau cuvântul prima dată domnului Chifu pentru o scurtă introducere și o să-l mai rog să intervină în mai multe reprize pe parcursul acestui prim panel, după care o să încercăm să intrăm în legătură directă cu Londra. Avem foarte mulți invitați deosebiți. Greg Simmons, pe care îl salut, generalul Medar, Narcis Bălășoi de la Center for Early Warning și avem și Jeffrey Michaels, care a lucrat pentru NATO și pentru King's College Londra, și doi invitați deosebiți și prin Skype, Matthew Elliott, care este arhitectul Brexitului, deci este cel care împreună cu Dominic Cummings au condus campania de Brexit în Marea Britanie, și Shamir Puri, care nu este doar un foarte fin observator și un profesor la King's College London, este o persoană care a scris un paper despre securitatea României pentru grupul de la Oxford de apărare. Ok. We can, I think, switch to English. I had a small, just a small intro in Romanian. The rest of the conference will be in English. We are welcoming you, and we are certainly very glad to meet in Bucharest for such an important topic. Mr. Chifu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Răzvan. Thank you very much. Thank to all of you who came here to see our conference. We succeed in packing very interesting personalities, Romanian and British alike, but also our good friend Greg Simmons from Sweden, and you're going to realize what is his role in the whole picture. We succeed in bringing at the table all the, let's say, the nuances of the reactions in relation with the Brexit. So we had Remainers, we have Brexiters, as you heard, Răzvan, the very ones that brought up the whole campaign on Brexit. And we also have representation of a hard Brexiter. You're going to discover the whole debate. For sure, we are making in the first stage for our guests. We cherish the fact that we can have their inputs, but we are also going to come with our own assessments, including my own, at the strategic level on what is Brexit and what does it mean for Romania, for the region, for the EU, and why not for NATO at the same time. I'm not going to repeat myself. You know the phrase, UK is retreating eventually from European Union. I'm still keeping the eventually, which is still under question, including the date. But it doesn't retreat from Europe, and the statements that we've heard at the 17th anniversary summit coming from UK is that their position inside NATO is going to be enforced, as well as their position in the European security matters. We are just enjoying that perspective, since UK is the second investor in our own security, and I will correct a little bit Răzvan with some nuances. We had Brits, we had Americans, we had Canadians, we also had Rafales, French Rafales. We also had in the fleet some participation at our exercises at the rotational force by French ships. So it's not only that the representation is on the other side of the ocean, but the enforcement of the eastern flank is coming not only from the countries in the region. As you know, Poland is investing and has their representation here in Romania. We had our representation in Poland and in some other places. It's also a participation of Western Europe in what happens here in Romania, in the Black Sea, in enforcing the southern tier of the eastern flank as well. That being said, I hope that the introduction has been made. I will let Răzvan introduce our guests one by one. At some point, I will take the floor just to present you my assessment on the strategic issues of what's happening in UK. My observation is that I'm following the Brexit since Prime Minister Cameron announced that after the election he's going to organize a referenda to look on the perspectives of Brexit. So from that point on, actually, I had my points. Okay, Răzvan, who's our first guest?
We're trying to ring Shamir Puri right now. Let's see if he can answer and if you can hear him. Shamir is author of a paper on Romania's defense strategy, written for Oxford's Changing Character of War program. He published a book on a forthcoming book in 2020 covering the EU-Russia strategy. Shamir, can you hear us? O să vedem dacă putem să intrăm în linie cu Shamir Puri. A mers mai devreme legătura. Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you to go first. You are second, but I'm going to ask you to go first. Jeffrey Michaels is a visiting research fellow for King's College London. He had experience working as an official with NATO and with US Defense Department. He has had visiting research fellowships at the Oxford Changing Character of War Center at Pembroke College and at Edmonton Institute in Brussels. And he is also author of a recent publication, which is The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy. It's co-authored with Sir Lawrence Friedman. So Jeffrey, we are certainly very glad to have you here, because I've been trying for 3 years to get you to come to our conferences, and I finally made it. So that's my
my thanks for that, and it's nice to be hard to get and in demand. First off, I'd like to thank Razvan and Julian for the invitation to come here, and I was especially sort of very impressed by Razvan. I sort of have to compliment him for these Nostradamus-like qualities in terms of picking today, of all days, to hold this event just right before the UK election. It really couldn't come at a better time. I sort of find myself in a bit of an awkward position being here because not being a citizen of the EU, not being a citizen of the UK, I'm just an American who's been around for a while in the UK system, especially with the working with the British Armed Forces. So I hope you'll take my remarks with that in mind. I think the first thing to say is that I think we need to appreciate the distinction between the situation of 2016, as was just mentioned before, and the situation today. Sort of my impression is that the fact that Brexit has dominated. Hopefully,
Hello?
Great. Shamir, can you hear us?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can definitely hear you.
All right. So we just have Jeffrey who started us off, and then we'll pass. We'll come to you in a bit. But it's great that you can hear us. So I will let Jeffrey carry on. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hello, Samir. Hope all's well over there. So my impression is the fact that Brexit has dominated the political agenda for so long has had an attritional effect, both within UK politics, but also within the EU more generally. I mean, if I could put it in very crude terms, Britain is less appealing than it used to be, which is a great shame, but I think it's also inevitable given the circumstances.
Hi, Jeff.
For a long time, I thought the Remain camp in the UK might have had a slim chance of shifting public opinion, which might have resulted in a shift of policy, maybe even in a second referendum, but I don't think that that's the case anymore. At this point, it's not the Remain camp that will be effective in keeping the UK in the EU, but paradoxically, it'll be the Leave camp that keeps the UK in the EU, because the onus is on them to make it happen, and for various reasons, they have been unsuccessful. I'm sort of reminded of Kafka's The Trial. If you're familiar with that story, Joseph K's meeting with the court painter Titorelli, where he's told about the prospects of acquittal from his case, and being told about the different options, and Titorelli refers to indefinite postponement, and I think that's basically where we are with the UK and Brexit at the moment. It's not quite going to be, I think, as bad as the negotiations between Moldova and Transnistria, which have lasted for decades, but hopefully within the next year or two, we'll see some progress. Now, although the issue itself is not going away, getting out is one thing, but sort of establishing a new relationship is another. This is going to be an issue that is with us for many years to come. So what does this mean for European security and defense? To what extent does Brexit matter? Well, I think there are three ways of trying to answer that question. The first is to look at the direct effects it has had, or it's often talked about as having. The second is to try to imagine an alternate reality in which the Leavers lost the 2016 referendum and the Brexit issue more or less died then and there. And the third is to simply step back, observe some of the broader trends with respect to European security specifically and international security more generally, and to try and assess the relevance of Brexit. So what effects has it actually had, and how important are these? Well, I'll just mention several. The first is the effect on the defense budget, the second is on the political bandwidth, and the third is on defense cooperation within the EU. So with respect to the budget, the UK remains committed to the NATO standard of 2%, although how it calculates what constitutes that 2% has been an issue that has received a great deal of criticism. As it relates to Brexit, I think the follow-on question is not really the 2% commitment, but the 2% of what? Okay? If the economy contracts as a result of Brexit, this means 2% of a smaller pot of government revenue. And there's also the problem of the value of sterling. Is Britain getting less for its money on the international market? Yes, it most certainly is. The obsession within NATO about 2%, I think, has been highly problematic in its own right for many years. It's been framing the discourse in a very artificial and unhelpful way. But perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. As for bandwidth, I think the most observers would say that I would say that the policy agenda has been dominated by Brexit, and this has meant that other policy problems have received less attention or less priority than would otherwise be the case. On the other hand, it's difficult, if not impossible, to quantify this. And I think there's a tradition within the UK civil service, at least, that minimizing the role politicians play is a good thing, though clearly officials have had to deal with the fallout of Brexit, which is probably more of a problem for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office than it is for the Ministry of Defence. As for defence cooperation with the EU, I think the impact of Brexit is negligible. On the one hand, the UK has doubled down on NATO. Well, I think this precedes the Brexit debate for a number of years. If you go back to 2011, after the Libya crisis, it was mainly the Royal Air Force that was making this argument within the Ministry of Defence. They had problems obtaining runway space in Italy for their planes in that operation, and they were making the case that actually the British government needed more staff officers within NATO to make their voice heard. And then, of course, after 2014, this emphasis on NATO increased even more. As for the relationship with the EU, sort of what was it actually doing before? What was Britain actually doing before? And I think it's sort of important to remember that Britain never really contributed much to the EU. It was never enthusiastic about contributing much to the EU. If you look at the contributions to various EU missions, especially out-of-area missions, if you go back to Artemis in 2003 in the Congo, the UK contribution always has been very small indeed. There are also missions that did not occur. For instance, when the UK led the EU battle group back in 2013, there was a great deal of reluctance to commit it, certainly reluctance in London to commit it to an operation in the Central African Republic. I also don't think that the UK was terribly interested in the EU doing more with respect to the EU either. And actually, the more important development as far as the EU missions are concerned is not the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, but the increasing reluctance of France to show much more enthusiasm for those sorts of missions. It's my understanding that within the French defense establishment, the prevailing view is that missions need to be planned and executed on a unilateral basis, maybe bilateral or multilateral, but not in an EU framework. And as far as working with the French bilaterally is concerned, this has always been the UK preference, so I don't see any major changes there. Can the EU do more without the UK, supposedly holding them back? Well, I very much doubt it. Although there's been a great deal of ink that's been spilled and a lot of conferences extolling the virtues of PESCO, I don't really see that making much of an effect. This is more about process rather than actual strategic outcome. As the intervention in the Central African Republic demonstrated, it was easier to get non-EU troops for this mission than actually contributions from EU states. So Georgian soldiers, for instance, played a very important role in that mission, wannabe EU states rather than the EU members themselves. And this issue of manpower is for me more important than the issue of kit. What would the situation be in an alternate reality? Well, I don't think that that would make much of a difference if the UK had lost, if the Remain camp had lost the Brexit vote or not. And this, I think, relates to the final point that I'll make about the broader trends within the field. I'll just briefly highlight a few of these trends before wrapping up. Within Europe, of course, the big military transformations that have occurred, although I think I'm sort of hesitant to use the word transformation at all, have taken place within NATO rather than the EU. Even without the Russian annexation of Crimea, I think major changes were likely to occur anyway within NATO, following their withdrawal from Afghanistan, and with NATO militaries having to adjust their roles accordingly. Counterinsurgency, large-scale operations like we saw in Afghanistan had their heyday, and something needed to replace them as the main effort. The Russian annexation of Crimea was a godsend for NATO. Now deterrence is fashionable again within the British Army. You hear, things like tanks are fashionable again, whereas 10 years ago, they were sort of effectively ruled out from ever playing a role again. The discourse in defense planning within NATO today is all about territorial defense, whereas before it was all about out-of-area missions. And you certainly see this shape where it's all about territorial defense and practically nothing about out-of-area missions. Even the Americans are back. If you recall back in 2011, 2012, 2013, the sort of discussions that we were having back then surrounding the announcement of the Asia pivot, where the Americans were supposedly going to be out of Europe, this is no longer the case either. The Americans are very much involved today in a way that would have been thought of more or less impossible back then. In the course of the last 10 years, the British military have gone from the comprehensive approach to the integrated approach to full spectrum operations, and now one hears a lot about the fusion doctrine. And at least in terms of terminology, there's been an evolution as well. Although I think the one thing that has shifted, or rather is shifting, and this I would probably attribute to Brexit, is this emphasis, at least rhetorically, on global Britain, demonstrating that, for example, the Royal Navy has a role to play in the South China Sea doing freedom of navigation operations and so forth. In some respects, the images that come to mind, however, are that of the paper tiger, that of the mouse that roared, because a lot of these capabilities that are being demonstrated with respect to global Britain are very much on the drawing boards rather than existing in reality. But in brief, if you consider the effects of Trump, everything that Russia has done and is doing at the moment, taking pretty much every step short of war to actually wage war against NATO. You look at the rise of China, something that NATO is finally addressing increasingly. But the trauma of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Turkish problem at the moment within NATO, the Hungarian problem at the moment within NATO, I think these are more important issues and more important trends driving the future of UK defense than Brexit. So just to conclude, not that British election manifestos have a lot to say about defense, I think if you look at these traditionally, but if you look at the current ones, if you look at the election manifestos of the Tories, the Lib Dems, Labour, the SNP, they're especially barren when it comes to defense. And sort of, not only is defense not a major political issue in the UK at the moment, but in terms of what to look out for in the future, I think in the next few years you'll see another sizable cut in the size of the armed forces. A shrinking economy, due in part at least to Brexit, may be responsible for this, but it was certainly something that's been on the policy agenda for some time, certainly long before 2016, and it's consistent with the general trend of UK defense since 1945. If you compare the 2020s with the 2000s in terms of hard power projection capabilities, I suspect that whereas the UK was able to deploy a division for out-of-area operations in 2003, in the years ahead, I think a brigade plus represents the maximum contribution for a major operation, and whereas at the height of the Afghan war it could sustain about 10,000 personnel indefinitely, nowadays the number is probably closer to 5,000 or 6,000. Though certainly in a lot of the NATO-Russia scenarios that we talk about today, it's not so much of an issue of the numbers, but the timeliness of their contribution. In some of the scenarios that I've seen, the British Armed Forces arrive about a month or two after the war has already ended, which is not a very good thing. So if I had to offer one takeaway, it would be that the impact of Brexit on European security will be minimal, but that's not to say no impact, because clearly it does have some, but that on a whole, it's basically the whole number of external and internal drivers that will be much more relevant. So on that, I'll turn it back to Samir.
Okay, Samir?
Great, and I'll speak at this volume. Just in case you can't hear or understand me, Razvan, perhaps you can just signal to me that there's any problem. Great. Well, thank you, Razvan, for the invitation. My apologies I can't attend in person. I'm just between delivering lectures at King's College London and Cambridge tomorrow. And of course, I have the enormous responsibility of casting my vote as well in the ballot box here in London, which I think is a really useful point at which to start my 10 minutes or so of comments. Because whilst I haven't been able to follow all of your mornings and afternoons discussion, certainly hearing Jeff Michael's excellent summation just now, there is an enormous amount that we still don't know because of the result of the UK election to come. And we'll know in about 36, 48 hours as to what kind of end game the Brexit saga is likely to have, simply in terms of the exiting from the European Union for the UK. I would like to cover both the uncertainty around the election, the interrelationship between the EU and NATO after Brexit, which I think is a really important angle through which to understand this, and to wrap up with a few historical perspectives on Eastern European security and Romanian security in relation to this changing, primarily Western European issue around Brexit. So to start with the first observation, which is on the way the UK is about to leave. Certainly, if the Conservatives are able to secure a bit of a majority, which is looking touch and go. Honestly, if I was a betting man, I would keep my money in my wallet because really it's too close to call as to which way the election is going to go. If the Conservatives get a majority, then what we can expect to see is a real tightening in the transatlantic relationship, certainly between the Boris Johnson, number 10 Downing Street, and Donald Trump White House. And whether that necessarily means a boost to NATO, we don't necessarily know, but there's certainly a lot NATO can do with a strong relationship between the London and Washington governments. If there is a Labour, God forbid, a Labour victory, which is highly unlikely, we can expect a much more sceptical British view in relation to NATO. But this, I think, is unlikely because the British civil service is obviously institutionally wedded to NATO membership, not only the Ministry of Defence, but beyond that. And there's a lot of fear that Jeremy Corbyn, in a position of power, would start to slaughter some sacred cows, which would produce something of a Hindu response in terms of the fate of those cows, which is catastrophe, and a swift moving, I think, to either stymie any kind of Corbyn attempt at a U-turn, shifting his positions from his lifelong ambition to presumably stand against NATO to seeking some kind of reform inside of NATO. So this is the big question mark, I think, certainly for Romanians in terms of the UK election, is the fate of transatlantic relations and the defence relationship between the UK and the US. Moving on to NATO and the EU and how they coexist. Of course, you'll have mentioned the Macron comment about NATO being brain dead. Something I find interesting about brain death is that if anyone knows anything about the human body can live on after the death of the brain in some way, shape, or form. But certainly some vital organs continue to pulsate and pump blood around the rest of the body. And this is quite a useful analogy. Macron didn't mean it in this way, which is even without the moral and the rhetorical leadership from Washington to give NATO that sense of purpose, that sense of mission that it had during the Cold War, that it had during the out-of-area operations that Jeff mentioned in Afghanistan. Even without all of that, the day-to-day business of NATO carries on, and it carries on in its normal bureaucratic, somewhat cumbersome way. But of course, it's resulted in the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states. It's resulted in the slightly changed naval presence in relation to the Black Sea. All this has happened at a time that Macron says that NATO is brain dead. That is hopefully a useful testament to the strength of the alliance as something that I suppose it's not good to present it as a headless, reanimated corpse, but nonetheless, it is still trundling forward and still producing many of the interrelationships in defence that are its core business in terms of outcomes. So I think Macron's comments were clearly created for political effect, and I don't necessarily think they compromise the bond in defence terms between NATO's decisions, certainly after the Warsaw Summit and its commitments to Eastern Europe, with all the issues that those commitments have. But really the question we want to ask ourselves in terms of Brexit is, well, what happens to NATO after Brexit? And here, I hope you can indulge in a bit of a historical analogy, a rather grand historical analogy, which is we have tended to hyphenate the EU and NATO, especially in Eastern Europe, in the sense of, well, as you know better than I, the two major tranches of EU expansion were certainly seen as very closely related to NATO membership, and the sequencing and the duality of those political, economic, and defence guarantees have been absolutely vital in determining the geopolitical fate of Eastern European countries in the last decade and a half, 2 decades. The Brexit development is a dramatic attempt by the British to dehyphenate EU and NATO membership. And this is my historical analogy. You're always going to fear that there's going to be a crumbling, perhaps, of these alliances in Eastern Europe. Well, actually, this is akin to the Western European Roman Empire collapsing before the the Eastern-facing Roman Empire. As you remember our history from 2 centuries ago, millennia ago. This grand experiment that's about to unfold for the UK means that there is a fragmentation in the EU's political integrity in the place that you'd probably least expect it, and purely from the geopolitical map. From Russia's perspective, this means that whilst the attempts to agitate and probe at the strength of the EU and the vitality of the EU has focused on the eastern part of the EU, this totally unrelated collapse in the western part of the EU is a dramatic gift. And it really comes down now to whether Britain can demonstrate that departure from the EU doesn't compromise and possibly even enhances its ability to be an active player in NATO. And that interrelationship between membership or lack of between these two multilateral clubs is something of history that's waiting to play out. I wonder whether, maybe not in Romania, but in other parts of the eastern part of the European Union, this dehyphenation will give political entrepreneurs of a later generation different ideas as to whether membership of one rather than the other is something that's possibly politically feasible. One could imagine if Viktor Orban was reborn and was campaigning for election right now afresh, whether his pitch would actually be heavily influenced by Brexit, with an elevation of NATO membership and a diminution of EU membership. Just a thought, I'm just putting that out there as something that is not unreasonable as a way in which a political entrepreneur can see membership of these alliance structures going ahead in the future. But just to give some rounding off comments in terms of the implications for defence, primarily with regards to Romania. About 2 years ago, I had the good fortune to work on a project that examined different NATO member states and their positions after the 2016 NATO summit. This was the first time NATO had the real emphasis and the real ability to reorient itself after the Ukraine conflict. Certainly the Normandy format meetings around the Ukraine conflict, which unfolded yesterday, if any of you have read the joint communique that came out from the French, German, American, French, German, Russian and Ukrainian leaders, you'll see that it was barely 2 sides long. And you'll see that it was a restatement of pretty much all of the assumptions around the Donbass war that I've held certainly ever since I was working in Ukraine in 2015. That means that there is a lot of continuity in the sources of insecurity in the Donbass. And I think for the EU and NATO member states that are bordering Ukraine and around that particular region, this means that there is an awful sense of business as usual going forward into the immediate future. And the Brexit distraction is one that is certainly unwelcome in terms of focusing NATO's minds and NATO member states' minds looking at the threat of Russia. The compromise on the EU's foreign policy coherence is considerable. And a lot of this will come down now to the first 4 or 5 months, 6 months of Joseph Borrell's stint as the EU external, or the chief of EU foreign affairs. He is inheriting a very weak position in the sense of an energized Macron, Angela Merkel, who's reaching the end of her chancellorship, and then a UK that's departing. Those are the 3 big military and foreign policy powers that were formerly in the EU until the UK's departure. I certainly think that with Joseph Borrell's attempts to project a coherent EU foreign policy compromised by Brexit, with NATO's attempts to project a coherent rhetorical story around its deterrence efforts compromised by Donald Trump, I certainly think the prognosis is not a catastrophe, but in my closing comments, I'd say the prognosis is very much of fluid international affairs and membership of alliances no longer being taken for granted as providing the continuity of support and backing, but re-emphasizing the importance of maneuvering within those alliance structures to continually extract reinforcing and reassuring messages. So I'll leave my comments there, Razvan. I think that's probably about 10 or 12 minutes.
On your radar regarding the Black Sea security, and how do you think that's going to play out going forward? If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and certainly, as my Romanian friends in the audience will know, the Montreux Convention, which is from the 1930s, was a pact that effectively tried to avoid the militarization of the Black Sea, which has then left NATO with a difficult dilemma of how to show that reassurance presence. And NATO has solved that by having much more frequent periodic naval visits by its member state navies into the Black Sea. From my perspective, I think the biggest issue is certainly Turkish-Russian bilateral relations and how those change in the next little while. This is extremely unpredictable. NATO, of course, its biggest weakness is the difficulties it's having with Turkey. Some of this will come down to, will not be resolved by, but will be explored by Russia's own foreign policy, attempting to attract Turkish attentions. It's done so very successfully in relation to Syria. Whether it starts to do so more energetically around energy issues now, perhaps as quid pro quos for things that have arisen from Syria, I think is going to be an enormously difficult issue around the continuity of security around the Black Sea, and in terms of how coherent NATO can be in providing that reassurance around Black Sea security.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments, Shamir. I know you are running from one conference to the next, and I am very grateful to you for making this time carved out in your schedule today, so that the folks here in Bucharest could hear your thoughts. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Razvan. Have a great rest of the conference, and we'll be in touch soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Nu, trebuie să ascultăm pe Michael, din păcate. Matthew. Că e legat de o anumită oră, de asta. Hello, Matthew.
Hello.
Right. Hello.
Is that good?
Yes, that's excellent. That's excellent. Okay, so I want to introduce to everyone again Matthew Elliott. Matthew is the person that, with Dominic Cummings, actually ran the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom. Before that, he ran the campaign against no to AV voting. And he is also has also started three very important civil society entities in the United Kingdom. This is the Taxpayers Alliance, that deals with kind of taxation issues and defense of citizen rights with respect to fiscal affairs. Big Brother Watch, which is an NGO dedicated to security and privacy issues. And also he was associated for a number of years with the business for Sterling. So he has been with the Brexit campaign. He campaigned for the Brexit campaign, and until 2 years ago, he was the Brexit campaign leader. So Matthew, thank you so much for agreeing to join our conference. I know you have a busy day today and you're running to a luncheon, but thank you so much for agreeing to be with us. So the floor is yours. We can hear you very well.
Thank you, Raz. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and I'm just sorry I couldn't join you in person. But of course, we've got a very important general election tomorrow. It's very unusual to have winter elections in the UK, but obviously these are unusual circumstances. So we're in for quite an exciting and interesting 48 hours. I wanted to split my remarks into 3 sections. The driving forces behind Brexit, and to clear up some misconceptions that people have about why Brexit came about. Then I'll talk about the election a little bit, and more importantly, the sort of 2 possible outcomes from the election and what that would mean for Brexit for the next few years. And then thirdly, talk about the impact of Brexit on European security and defence, which I know is the theme of your conference today. So starting off with the first section about the driving forces behind Brexit. A lot's been written about this, and I sometimes get very frustrated that often in some of the books and articles, particularly those overseas, they tend to emphasise issues like migration as being a driving force and make it as if that was the preeminent reason why Britain voted to leave. And I can categorically say that wasn't the case. If you look at all the polling after the referendum campaign, the sort of key point was independence or sovereignty, or to use the phrase that we had in the campaign, take back control. It was all about taking back control from the EU. I think there was a frustration in the UK that more and more laws were being made at the EU level outside of our control. There was a general feeling in the population that things weren't going the way the UK government wanted them to in many respects. People felt it was time to break that link and to sort of return sovereignty to the UK. So that take back control message was the thing, the key driver. And if you look at a list of key drivers, the first one was independence or take back control. The second one was much more about the money side of things, the amount of money we give to the EU every year. And then sort of third in the list would come migration. But even with the migration question, if you dig down in the polling or do lots of focus groups as we did at the time, people's primary concern was about the lack of control. They didn't like open borders or unfettered migration. They wanted to have that feeling that the government was controlling who came to the UK, and that's why in this election campaign, you'll hear from Boris Johnson about how he wants to bring in a points-based system where there's greater control about who comes to the UK, and he's actually wanting to have not only the best and the brightest from across the world, but people of all skill sets coming to the UK, but in a more controlled fashion. So in summary, key driving force behind Brexit was, of course, the sort of quest for independence and sovereignty and taking back control. So will Brexit actually happen? We sort of have this conference 3.5 years after the 23rd of June 2016. And the question must be, will Brexit actually take place? It's been a long time since the vote, a lot's happened. Will it actually take place? And there were some months this year where it certainly looked sort of touch and go whether or not Brexit would actually happen. I'm confident it will, but as I was saying at the beginning, a lot depends on the next 48 hours, what happens in voting day tomorrow when Britain goes to the polls. Now, if you've been following the polling during the campaign, you will see that the Conservative Party have basically been more or less 10 points ahead of the Labour Party in the polls, even though both of the parties have squeezed their basis. So obviously at the beginning of the campaign, when Nigel Farage decided to stand down his Brexit Party candidates in Conservative seats, You then saw the Conservative Party massively squeeze the Brexit Party vote and sort of have a surge in the polls up. And that's when you saw some of their 12, 13, 14, 15% leads in the polls. But then what we've seen in the latter part of the campaign is quite an effective operation by the Labour Party to squeeze the Liberal Democrat support. So the Liberal Democrats who went into this election with about 20% of the polls and now down to about 10% in most of the polling. So both parties are basically still more or less 10 points apart, but at a slightly higher level of polling. Now, what will that mean on election day? We have a very good polling company called YouGov in the UK, who did a very big 100,000 person poll and analysed it using MRP. And that was published last night at 10 p.m. And what was interesting was the difference between their first MRP poll of this campaign, which came out about 2 weeks ago, and the one that came out last night. And what we'd seen in the space of those 2 weeks was the projected Conservative majority in the next Parliament go from 68, that was the one 2 weeks ago, down to 28 last night. So quite a big fall in the projected majority for the Conservative Party. And being good statisticians, they had quite a range of support. And they said that for the first time, in their opinion, there's now a statistical chance of a hung Parliament. So their range went from 311 Conservative MPs right up to the Conservatives having quite a big majority. But if they come in at 311, that's below the crucial 325 they need to have a working majority in the House of Commons. So we could be in the realms of having another hung Parliament after tomorrow's vote. That's still in the statistical realms. Now, what would happen under those two circumstances? So either a hung Parliament or a working majority. Now, if Boris gets a working majority, so more than 325 MPs, then he's home and dry. He'll be able to get his withdrawal agreement through. That will pass sometime in January. It will pass easily the House of Lords, because the House of Lords has to pass things which have been in a party manifesto, and it will come into law, and I wouldn't anticipate any problems with the European Parliament also ratifying it to allow Britain to leave the political institutions of the EU on the 31st of January. Now, of course, there will still be a huge debate. That's not the end of Brexit. Of course, a big slogan has been in this election, get Brexit done. In a sense, it should really be get the withdrawal agreement passed, because, of course, after the 31st of January, they still need to agree the free trade agreement with the EU, and they hope to do that by the end of the year. So there's still more to do, but a crow would have been passed if they get a majority. In the event of a hung Parliament, this is where the Northern Irish parties come into play, primarily the DUP. Now, as you'll remember, the DUP were the Northern Irish party backing Theresa May's government, but then not backing her withdrawal agreement. And they're also not happy with the deal that Boris Johnson struck in October of this year. So there's a big question mark about whether they back him for the withdrawal agreement this time round. And in fact, if the Conservatives get slightly less than, be within spitting distance of a majority, you might even see a situation where you have a coalition government led by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, it could come under various guises. I doubt it would be a formal coalition between the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalists. I doubt it'd be a formal coalition, but I could imagine perhaps a formal coalition between Labour and the SNP, and then a more informal supply and confidence support from the Liberal Democrats to allow them to get a Queen's speech through and to crucially allow them to move Brexit on. Now, what would that mean for Brexit? The Labour Party policy is to do another renegotiation and then put it to the British people. I've got a feeling that under that scenario of more of a coalition type government, you probably fast forward quite quickly to having a second referendum with Remain on the table. And it'd be interesting to see what happened in that situation. In some ways, the Leave support has consolidated in the past 3.5 years, but it would be anybody's guess what would happen at that referendum. So really, the next 48 hours are crucial, and we should know with some clarity what will happen after that. And just to put my sort of cards on the table, I would say that there's probably an 80% chance of the Conservatives getting a working majority, and just a 20% chance of it being a hung parliament. And if they get a majority, I expect it to be around the 20 seat majority figure. So the final section of what I want to talk about, the Brexit impact, the future of security and defence in the European Union and Europe. One crucial thing I want to say is that for Boris Johnson, who, of course, I got to know very well on the Vote Leave campaign, and I still liaise regularly with Number 10 and the key Brexiteers in government. And for them, Brexit was really part of a sort of liberal internationalist vision. So they saw in many ways the EU as being, for example, too protectionist when it came to trade, and almost in some way sort of holding Britain back in the world. So the crucial thing from this is that for Brexit, for them, isn't about Britain withdrawing into itself and closing the drawbridge and becoming Little Britain. That's not Brexit in their eyes. They see Brexit as being a position where the UK can, yes, have a trade deal with the EU, but also have trade deals with countries right across the world, but also crucially continue engaging actively in all sorts of European bodies, from the UN through to NATO, through to all the other international bodies you can think of. So crucially, when it comes to defence, of course, NATO will be, and has always been since Second World War, has been a crucial component of international cooperation in that area. And I would hope that the London summit last week just underlined the commitment of the UK to NATO. And also, Johnson has kept the 2% commitment of government spending for defence, and it's encouraging to see other countries also meet that 2% target over the coming years. So that's an encouraging sign to see. Britain is fully committed to NATO and everything to do with NATO. And of course, it's also fully committed to the UN, and the UK will continue to play an active role on the UN Security Council going forward. And also, perhaps most crucially, when it comes to intelligence sharing, there are different mechanisms for that. Of course, from a UK point of view, there's the Five Eyes network, and we work very closely with the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand when it comes to sharing intelligence. But also there are well-established mechanisms to share intelligence with other partners within the European Union. And one thing that both Theresa May and also Boris Johnson have underlined is they want to continue intelligence sharing going forward post-Brexit, which I think is actually crucial to security going forward. Another key component when it comes to defence, of course, is it's not just about international groups. It's frankly to do with countries and the size of their armed forces. And within a European context, it has to be said that the France and the UK are the two powers within Europe with the biggest militaries. And what's been interesting in the past sort of 5 years, really since David Cameron was Prime Minister, is actually how the UK and France have been working ever more closely together in a formal way when it comes to the military and defence. And that's been outside of the structures of the European Union. And also that, again, will be unaffected by Brexit. Both the Boris Johnson, the current defence minister, have said that. And I think it's also significant that the current UK ambassador to France, Ed Llewellyn, was David Cameron's chief of staff, and he's created a very close bond between the French and UK administrations. Yes, it's been strained by Brexit in the past few years, but in many other areas it's extremely strong. So really, I have, I hope, an optimistic view for the future. I think that the British people didn't feel the EU as the right fit for them as a political union. They're very keen that we keep on trading with the EU closely, but also working on a bilateral basis with the EU very closely when it comes to all sorts of matters, not least defence and security. So I hope actually it'll be a more positive relationship going forward, in one that both sides may feel more comfortable in. And I'll leave it on that. Thank you, Raz.
Thank you so much. We will move on. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
So, General Medar, thank you so much. Can you address the audience? Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. And I will try to tell you some thoughts, but will be very difficult after people who leave Brexit. We are outsider. We are from outside. And I would like to tell you my opinions, my own opinions regarding how I see Brexit. And coming from an old four-star general, I think could be find some ideas from the people from inside too. First of all, I would like to mention that for me, and not only for me, United Kingdom was a global power and still is. During the discussions, during the negotiations, sometimes was not treated like a global power. On the other side, we can see now and we can understand, for me, from outside, because all the time I was asking myself about why this was happened. In European Union, to be in European Union, you have to see a part of your sovereignty, but you receive prosperity. By my opinion, United Kingdom didn't want to do this, and they wanted to keep more their sovereignty and to have less prosperity, because always, at least up to now, United Kingdom was a prosperous country. What can do now? Let's suppose Brexit will happen. Let's suppose again. If Brexit will leave European Union, will be only one chance, to be closer with the United States. Now, it is close with the United States, but to be closer. We don't have to forget that in September this year, United Kingdom signed an agreement with the United States, a commercial agreement. But on the other side, we can see that Great Britain kept the links, the connections with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. United Kingdom was mentioned here, the Five Eyes Agreement, which means sharing intelligence top secret between these five countries. It means United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There are some discussions to extend this agreement up to after Brexit with some European countries, or to have something like that. But Western Europe has now a huge question. The question of Western Europe is European security with Russia or against Russia. When they will give the answer for this, will be discussed this Five Eyes Agreement extended, intelligence agreement, to be extended with the United Kingdom too. What chances will have Brexit regarding these countries? The first of all is to continue the connection to the European Union countries, which is the most obvious version. In the same time, they have to extend the bilateral agreements with European countries, but anyhow, they have to follow the European Union directions. On the other side, another option that they will have is to be closer with these four countries I mentioned before. But here, geography is against. But the world was changed. The world is in another way. And this could be an option. If will be or not, we'll see. By my opinion, the most natural option is with European countries, or could be both. If we are speaking about defense, up to now, the biggest partner of United Kingdom was United States. And this will continue. For Washington, London is the main mediator between the United States and Brussels. Now will be not anymore. It means that Washington has to negotiate directly with Brussels, which is not very easy. On the other side, it's very clear, and here is no doubt, at least for me, that United Kingdom will continue to be a very serious and powerful partner in NATO. But there are, if you know, some initiatives led by President Macron about European defense. Do you think that an European defense without United States, Canada, Great Britain, Turkey, and Norway can deter Russia? Will be Russia afraid from an army, or because now we don't speak too much about armies, we are speaking about war, but not necessary armies. Could this discourage Russia? It's very difficult. It means that NATO is the only, but the only, with the capital letters, solution for defending Europe in all the ways of the capabilities of the war today. In this case, what is important is how in the defense and military field, after Brexit, United Kingdom will deal and will participate, because it's an European country, can participate in the security of the Europe. How this could be possible? It means that the format of this kind of participation was not yet done. There is a proposal of the of Macron regarding to be built a Council of Security in Europe, but we'll see. Now, the plan for United Kingdom to spend money for 2%, with 2% from GDP for defense, is that 37.6 billion pounds. It means that it's a very serious participation in this field too. In 2018 was initiated the European Initiative for Defense. This was after was approved the Brexit. It means that Europe wants to have United Kingdom in their system of security and defense. After that was created Framework Participation Agreement, where it means that Great Britain could participate to the CSDP missions. In this case, United Kingdom will not have the right to participate to the political decision, the right to participate to the military decision, the right to participate at planning operation, and lead operations. Looking at this, it means that will be not possible for United Kingdom company to have a platoon from Germany inside, because it's not allowed. And I remember in Afghanistan, I've seen with my eyes a Romanian company, and inside the Romanian company was an American platoon. And I've seen them in front of me, each of the platoons with the flag. All flags are Romanian, except one, an American one. It means that in the United States relations with their allies, it is possible. I think this is a mistake that was the decision for European defense. We don't have to forget that United Kingdom was the main contributor to spatial programs in Europe, Galileo and Copernicus. According with the new format, the proposal for the new format, London will not have access to the top secret informations collected by these two systems. This is why they started to build their own. It's something, again, that must be changed. My opinion regarding the effect, and here I have to contradict our friend, regarding if the defense of Europe, defending Europe, will be more difficult after Brexit, my opinion is yes. Defending Europe because, and I would like to mention not only one, it's coming in my mind now. First of all, deterrence, as I explained. The second is participation with intelligence. And the third is the help for public order people, anti-terrorist fight, where the United Kingdom experience is unbelievable. And the United Kingdom reaction to the terrorist attacks was very well planned and very well done. Even from outside, some people who are not expert in this thing could say that was like in France or in Holland. No. The Brexit is taking time. It's happening in a very difficult time for the world. There is no international order. The world economy is preparing themselves for a recession. And Russia is more aggressive, looking for Turkey to be a real ally. Up to now, it's not yet. They have good connections, but it's difficult to say that Turkey is an ally and a member in NATO, and at the same time is an ally of Russia. Has good relations, but not an ally. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, so I'll give a couple of different dimensions. One as an EU citizen, the other one is having current and historical family connections to different parts of the British Empire. So, when looking at this, it's a little bit outside in, inside out. So I don't particularly favour any particular camp, but what I like to do is to see how both camps try and play this in order to get a more encompassing overall perspective rather than just looking at it one particular angle. So, well, the first point I would say, which I think hasn't been raised yet, which is interesting. This whole Brexit thing, I think, was, you could either say, a mistake or a miscalculation. And that came about by David Cameron when he did not have to, but he thought he had the numbers for Remain and ran what he thought was a sure winner, and he was wrong. He miscalculated. It showed a certain distance of the political elite from what was being seen on the streets by ordinary people, perception and public opinion. And it should also be noted that, I mean, the Speaker's been far too rational. This debate is not rational. This is emotional. And trying to look at something, an emotional event from a rational perspective, does not bring great results, as another point of view. And both sides are using emotions. On the one side, the Remain, which you can say are in this global liberal camp, which adhere to such values as multiculturalism, globalisation, so in very general terms. And the Brexiters who, they're not so into this. They're into a more national interest and to come back from this this multiculturalism, other particular points of view which they do not feel has been particularly advantageous for them. I mean, so if you look at it from this point of view, I mean, Matthew was mentioning a few of these things which are generally not mentioned. I mean, a lot of this has been, as he said, superficial. It's been looking at these things like immigration and so forth, which is not really the issue, as he pointed out. It's more what some British have been seeing as the excesses of EU bureaucracy, and also these, what they call worrying trends, and this includes in defence. I remember in September, after the Brexit vote, I was in Creeze in southern Poland, and there was a gentleman who had just come out of 20 years in New Scotland Yard. And so I found out he is British. I'm normally much more diplomatic about these kinds of things, but as soon as I found out this, I asked him, okay, Brexit. So we got on to the discussion of Brexit. And he says, well, yes, I'm a Europeanist. I believe in this idea of a European community, etc., etc. He says that the original idea, the European community rather than the EU, if you take a look at that, with the economic focus rather than this more political, cultural dimension which is emerging. And he says that he found it disturbing with the different laws, which was earlier mentioned, which were found to be increasingly intrusive into private affairs when it shouldn't. The focus, according to him, should be economics. And he said the final straw for him, because he called himself a Europeanist, but he voted for Brexit. And he said the talk which eventually sealed the deal, why he voted for Brexit, was the talk of a European army. Because here we're talking about cultural and historical memory and national identities. And if you go back in cultural and historical memory of Britain, there were exactly 2 times in history when there was a European army, and both times Britain was on the sharp end, Napoleon and Hitler. So this is ringing these warning bells for them. And it's not something very comfortable at all. So, and I think what also assisted with the Brexit campaign was the arrogance and complacency that the Remainers would win. And what happened here is this gave them no impetus to go out and vote or to be a part of the referendum. We're going to win, etc. Where conversely, the Brexiters getting triggered with all of these different things, all these different polls which predicted the Remains would win, were pushed to go out and give their particular contribution. And what we see afterwards, I think, because like 2016 across the ditch, I mean, these unthinkable, unpredictable events came about. And what we have is this kind of gradual breakdown of this, what you call this liberal global kind of dimension to the politics. And this is why you have the likes of Johnson and Trump getting along in their own special way as being those who oppose the mainstream liberal politics, or supposedly so. I do suspect Johnson is a much more, well, should we say, cynical and more someone who will chop and change as he has done. But the problem for British politics, Cameron opened Pandora's box, and every other Prime Minister who has come along since has been having to deal with this thing which has been hoisted upon them. And I think what has aided the Brexiters a little bit more is the reaction of top EU officials, namely Juncker and Tusk, whose strong words, I mean, this is, if anything, the most likely reaction is to entrench the particular decision that Brexit was the right thing to do. I mean, you do have people who are swaying on both sides. I mean, I have cousins who are on both sides of the equation. There are those who are saying, well, this is going to be disastrous for Britain, it's economically, et cetera, and then you've got those who sort of try to revive this kind of national identity which was being lost by this EU approach to speak with one voice and all of these things, which saw their ability to express identity and interests getting constricted. And I mean, who knows how long this will go on for, but one thing is for sure is that it is, I think, at least for the medium term, maybe longer, it is irreconcilably split British society along value lines, Remain and Brexit. And, well, how this will play out, we shall see in the longer term. I don't hold any particular optimistic tone concerning any reconciliation, because whatever way it goes, there is going to be a winner and a loser. And the loser is not going to be taking it lying down. They're going to keep fighting. So how long this goes on for, we shall see.
Now the final speaker, Narcis Bălășoiu. Thank you.
Thank you. Even though I'm the last one, I'm not going to draw the conclusion. I have something specific to tell you. Thank you, first of all, for having me today. I can only congratulate the organizer for bringing on the table this critical topic. The timing is also very interesting. Consider that tomorrow in the UK there will be elections. So it's a critical topic, not only for UK, not only for the European Union, but particularly I would say for some countries like Romania, for instance, and for which this issue might prove very, very sensitive. Why I'm saying that, as most of you probably learned by now, the Romanians represent one of the largest migrant communities in the Great Britain. The official number is somewhere 400,000, but in reality, I think it is at least double than this. So a no-deal outcome, for example, with negative effects on the foreign workforce, it would become a very, very delicate issue for us. I was invited today to contribute to this wider picture with a few, let's say, pragmatic details concerning the economic implications of the Brexit. However, the fact is that when discussing about economic implications, we enter a very ambiguous terrain with lots of biases, with lots of unknown parameters. And believe me, it's close to mission impossible to find a common denominator among the scholars, among the experts in economy, when it comes to pointing out or determining the effects that Brexit would trigger in terms of economy. Even so, by overlapping different studies, analysis, forecasts, and numbers, of course, one could manage to narrow a little bit the sight and get some sort of perspective on what is to come in this area. Of course, there is also a big challenge to make such an assessment in the context that we have only bits of the picture and no certainties on the political outcome. Tomorrow we have the election. Boris Johnson that is going for a full-speed Brexit, and versus the Labourists that will seek to renegotiate the deal and then to support it to a referendum. So all this matters because there is a big difference when talking about the economy issue and trying to do some forecasts between a soft landing scenario and a no-deal one. So some of the indicators, for example, the GDP and the GDP contraction, more precisely, tend to double in the no-deal scenario, and this type of correlation can be extended to many areas. Long story short, I will try to share with you some sort of conclusion, if I might say so, that encompasses the most relevant area that Brexit would somehow impact. First of all, let's not forget that United Kingdom is the Union's second largest economy, and almost half of all its overseas investments come from the EU, and thus a similar proportion of its export revenues. Depending on the scenario, Brexit could impose significant costs on UK citizens and businesses. In the worst case scenario, many analyses suggest that we'll encounter a loss of income per head of roughly 1,000 euro by 2030, if we stick to the today prices. At the other hand of the spectrum, the best case scenario, which should be a win-win scenario, actually reveals a small rise in income per head up to 40 euro by 2030. For UK, exports would fall by as much as 9%, and imports by up to 9.5% in the worst case scenario, compared to a baseline of continued European membership. Several models also confirm that the economic implication of the Brexit are much more significant for the UK than for the rest of the world. Overall, the impact of the rest of the EU is very modest, to be honest. I would like to highlight here the case of Ireland. Ireland is found to be considered the most vulnerable member state, reflecting its stronger ties and investments with the UK. Real GDP in Ireland drops by up to 2.5% compared to baseline in the worst case scenario. Any failure to sign any type of preferential trade deal, reverting to the most favored nation status, would bring such a negative outcome for Ireland, irrespective of the UK subsequent policy response. So, if you really try to find that common denominator that I talked to you in the first place, in all those ventilated prospective models, we can dare saying that UK will be economically worse off outside of the EU under most plausible scenarios. The key question is for the UK is how much worse off it will be post-Brexit. The failure of the UK to achieve an open trading and investment with the EU would have negative implication for both of the parties, that's for sure. The option of leaving the EU with no deal and simply applying for the World Trade Organization rule would lead to the greatest economic losses for the UK. The analysis of this particular scenario suggests that training under WTO rules would reduce the GDP by around 5% 10 years after the Brexit. So a contraction in GDP of 5% 10 years after the Brexit. Or 140 billion euro, compared with the same timeline in EU membership. This is an average. This is an average, the 5% that I'm telling you about. There are reliable analyses, I might say, talking of 7, 8, or even 10%, while entities like Oxford Economics suggest a contraction of the GDP of roughly 3.5 to 4%. So it's complicated to determine what will be the real figure. The WTO outcome will likely move the UK decisively away from EU standards and result in significantly increased non-tariff standards, harming the ability of the UK businesses also to sell services in the UK, EU countries. As you probably know, the service sector, including the financial services, dominate UK economy, contributing by up to 80% of its GDP. So the service sector contributes to 80% of the UK GDP, and this seems to be dramatically affected. Also, under the WTO rules, the European Union would also lose out economically, but nowhere near the same proportion as the UK. The economic loss to the EU could be about 0.7% of its overall GDP in 10 years after the Brexit. Actually, any trade scenario would be considerably better for the UK than the WTO rules, as you can imagine, but most would still lead to economic losses compared to its current status as an EU member. Even though EU seems to be committed to engage with UK during Brexit negotiations, but it may see benefit also in adopting a zero-sum game approach. And this is because Europe's top political priority is to discourage other members to withdraw from the European Union. It will be important for the UK to seek ways to move away from a zero-sum game and towards a positive-sum game as negotiations proceed in order to ensure the best possible deal for all the parties. Please also allow me to give you just a few numbers related to the Romania-UK economic ties. We have a a positive trade balance with UK, while near 6% of our EU exports go to Great Britain. So we export more than we import. It's 1.2 million versus 1.7 billion euro. According to our economy ministry, actually is the defunct small and medium enterprises ministry, the less probable scenario of a no deal, we should be prepared for some custom duty enforcing. More precisely, an average of 5.7% to export towards UK versus an average of 4.3% applied to UK imports. But when it comes to imports, there are some particular cases in agricultural goods where the taxes can go up to 20%. So, to conclude, this overall picture is that is in the best interest of the UK and to a lesser extent the EU to work together to achieve some sort of an open trading and investment relationship post-Brexit. The no deal, so WTO rules, option would be economically damaging for both parties, but for the EU, to some extent, it's a matter of border sharing, after all, among the member states, while for UK will be much more complicated and painful, I would say, to metabolize all the changes in the coming decade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Narcis. I would like to ask Mr. Kiefer now for a wrap-up, and then we're going to have the question and answer session, which is usually a fun event and lively one.
Thank you very much. I will not stay too much between you and the Q&A session, but I wanted to steal the end of the presentation from Narcis, so I will do that. I will want to make 5 points. The first one is on the geopolitics of the EU without UK. Responsibilities for Brexit. The third point is with UK role in the EU. We have to contemplate that one as well. The fourth point is the vote in UK tomorrow. We've already, and the impact to the Brexit, we already had some inputs already, but I will make some nuances from my point of view. And the fifth point is EU-NATO relations after Brexit, a French approach together with it was already invoked here, the European Army. So coming back to my first point, geopolitics in the EU and the EU without UK. As you know, at this point already, at the level of the European Union, our genes and DNA are talking about Euro-Atlantic links. It comes from the basis of the forming of the three communities. It comes from the basis of NATO 1949 build-up, the Atlantic and the Washington Treaty. Actually, the Euro-Atlantic relationship is the original geopolitics of the European Union after the Second World War, with the formats built up afterwards. Now, we already are talking about two alternative geopolitics. One is a Eurasian approach, and that could be pictured not by the Eurasianism of Putin in Moscow, but by a type of Eurasianism that can be reflected by the Messenberg agreements, meaning EU-Russia parity in security matters. It has been attempted during the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev. It didn't work. It didn't deliver. The provisions have been underlined the fact that Russia should have been delivered a solution for Transnistria in a very short term. It didn't work. Actually, we don't know how much this Eurasianism is behind us. Considering the interview of President Macron some 2 to 3 weeks ago, the very famous one with the brain death of NATO, in that very interview, an approach to European side Eurasianism is back. So Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok rather than a Euro-Atlantic link. The third approach, third discussions on the geopolitics of the EU is also coming more in the forefront from France. It is an independent EU sitting between US and China at once. It's a new framework where, you know, we should learn, President Macron was telling us who's the enemy of the EU, which way we should look at, and he's proposing this approach of making a global Europe, a global security actor, and who has to sit in between, neutral and independent from US, China, in their debates, in their trade war, but also in their political, geopolitical approaches to the world. So, EU without UK, there's a high possibility that the last 2 points of the geopolitics of the EU are coming back and forward, and we can look and contemplate those debates and maybe some changes in that area, less Euro-Atlanticism from the point of view of the EU. The second point, responsibilities from Brexit. It has been already mentioned here, David Cameron and its mistakes. It's Greg, I suppose, was with Cameron's bets, high-risk bets, where he lost actually his bet on Remainers. But since Brexit is a responsibility first and foremost of the UK, because the referendum happened in UK and UK decided to withdraw from the European Union. At the same time, it is a matter that harms ourselves. It is also a matter of responsibility of the EU. And from my point of view, President Juncker is also a part of the game. I suppose that the EU should have made more when the referenda related to UK withdrawal has been developed in Great Britain, the campaign and everything else around. I suppose that EU should have had a saying, and the Commission should have been more involved in promoting, if not in the general information, not entering into the campaign, but at least being involved in telling what he is doing for Great Britain communities, at least. The third point is about UK role in the EU. As we all know, EU has 2 member states who are permanent member of the UN Security Council. UK is one of them, France is the other one. It's also the same in what relates to nuclear deterrence. Nuclear capabilities in EU states, member states, are from Great Britain and from France. Once UK retreats, we just have one member state with nuclear capabilities and with a seat as a permanent member in the Security Council, meaning that we are moving to a type of French exceptionalism that we can, by the way, foresee and contemplate even those days. It already begins to have its own pump-ups and spread in the European politics. The second point is that UK has always have been balancing actor between France and Germany first and foremost. It has been Germany's partner in trade, economic, austerity, competitivity, free market politics. At the same time, it has been the best and the closest partner of France in defense and security matters. With the retreat of the UK from the picture, for sure, both of those balancing acts are disappearing, and we are moving closer to higher ambition of France to take over the European defense and security, and Germany for sure is staying with the economic part of the leadership. But at the same time, regarding the votes, the double majority votes, once UK retreats from the EU, a German-French affair in a very certain politics can be offsetted only by the next 13 countries on the row as a strategic weight, number of population and territory and weight in the vote, which means practically never. So there's a shift who can move European affairs from multilateralism that we have nowadays to more of a France-Germany affair. There's a high possibility that in a lot of other matters, France and Germany have different points of view. For sure, at the level of the EU, countries are going to align one way or another, some joining France, some joining Germany, in their respective interests to one matter or another. But if that type of divergences continues, for sure those alliances are going to be enforced and repeated to different other means. So at some point we are going to contemplate a splitted Europe, a Germany group and a French group who are always going to have different ideas on matters that are under the majority rule vote. It's also a problem of a split of Europe. I will remind you, and the same point of the UK role in the EU, the fact that the investment in security and defense for Europe that once were in 2017 ensured 83% by countries outside the EU. In 2018, it's 82% of the investment. I mean, US, Canada, Norway, Turkey, countries that are not member of the EU, but are investing in the security and defense of Europe. Once UK withdraw from Europe after the Brexit, the percentages is going to be much heavier. I don't have the figures and I don't want to speculate, but I just have the figures from 2017 and 2018. And in those terms, any rise of the percentages investment in defense and security by external countries outside the EU is putting on a big question mark the capacity, the strategic autonomy, as we put them, of European Union. Another point with UK role is the investments in security and their interests in the eastern flank. UK is very well known and has important investments in the eastern flank, including in Romania. Once it retreats, for sure, the balance of interests of EU countries in what's happened in the eastern flank is going to shift dramatically, and this is going to shift for more interest, as you can read in Emmanuel Macron's interview, but also in the statements after the NATO summit, towards terrorism, towards Northern Africa, towards some other type of threats, and the gap between the threat assessments of EU member states in the East and in the West is going to be larger. My first point is about the vote in the UK tomorrow and the impact on Brexit. I will not repeat what has been said already from London here. I just have 2 points which are making a difference on what has been said. The first one is the fact that we are waiting, and I suspect it's going to be a game changer. The report of the UK intelligence on Russia's involvement in Brexit referenda. The report has been already printed. It has been presented to the cabinet, but Boris Johnson blocked the publication until the election tomorrow. I suspect that it won't last until any type of vote in the UK Parliament related to Brexit. The pressure is already very high. We already have some data during the campaign about Russian oligarchs' investment in the campaign of the Conservative Party. By the way, never happened before such a big, well, it's not very big investment. It's on the range of up to £1 million, but it is already charted for 2018, 2019, and the rationale is the support for the Brexit approach. And this is going to be a game changer, and my guess is that the referendum that we've heard about, either the Brexit agreement of Mr. Johnson, either a Remainer, the type of referendum proposed and promised by the Labourers and for sure the Liberal Democrats, SNP, is going to become mandatory once that report is coming public, because the main personalities that took the profits of this investment, this involvement of Russia in the Brexit referenda, are Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And my last point is about the European Army. You already know it's a lost game. Even the European Intervention Initiative that France attempted to put aside the PESCO, so investment proposal of 10 member states to go further, is behind us. NATO branded, just read the final declaration of the NATO summit 10 days ago, and the first point is already, by the way, signed by France, by Emmanuel Macron. The first point of the declaration is already putting behind us the original statement of President Macron. And by the about the EU army, as you have seen, since the investment in security and defense of Europe is coming from outside the EU, it's very difficult to move to such a project, which, by the way, has been put down by the Rome Declaration, 9th of May 2017, that launched the reflection, and the final declaration in Sibiu, 9th of May this year, with everything else. So, okay, what's still there? European countries, EU countries need to invest one way or another. If they invest in defense, it means US doesn't have any motive to leave NATO. By the way, we've heard President Trump being the most successful and the first supporter of NATO 10 days ago. And if they don't invest, in any case, we cannot move at any point to any type of EU format of defense by itself, because there are no means. By the way, and with this I'm ending, the percentage of the France investment in its defense is 1.87 this year, which means that even France didn't meet the threshold of 2% of the GDP. Why or how any ambition to build up a European independent or autonomous defense? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes our panel. And now there are two microphones. There's one at the back with my colleague Andrei Dan. Thank you so much. Please feel free to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Răzvan, and thank you for very insightful presentations. Cristina Buzashu, State Councillor for EU Affairs and UK resident for more than 5 years. So after 3 years and a half, it seems like Brexit is very likely going to happen. We'll see what happens in the elections tomorrow. But if Boris Johnson wins, as predicted, by 80% chance, and he will get Brexit done, the withdrawal agreement passes, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the issue of UK territorial integrity after Brexit. And I'm referring here mostly to a potential Irish reunification or a second referendum on Scottish independence, and if this would impact the security architecture in any way. Thank you.
Greg, do you want to take this, and Jeffrey?
Sure. You or I first? Please. Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, it's a very big if, because polls lately have not been very accurate in predicting major political events. But let's run by the scenario. yes, it will probably trigger a number of things, because there are always two sides to a crisis. Everyone focuses on the negative side, who's going to lose what. But where someone loses something, other opportunistic parties gain something. And you can already see them positioning themselves around now. I mean, you can see with the Scottish referendum, especially some very long-term, shall we say, Scottish politicians who have had many ups and downs, see this as an opportunity. They don't see this as being something necessarily negative. And yeah, the same applies to Northern Ireland. But I mean, how that, well, it would have significant impact on just British security, etc., because Scotland, I mean, it's access to the North Sea, all of these, it's always been a major part of the British defence system. I mean, if you look in the First and the Second World War, Scapa Flow and all of these particular bases were extremely important. And I mean, you've got a lot of things which are deployed there, which, I mean, it'll create a mess. So, I mean, the mess initially would be for the United Kingdom, or whatever remnants remain after those opportunistic ones, politicians in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. I mean, if they're able to capitalise on the crisis for their own particular advantage and gain.
Yes, I mean, first on Northern Ireland, I think that the prospect of Northern Ireland seeking to break away from the UK is a non-starter. There's just too much history there, and I just don't see that happening regardless of anything that happens with respect to the EU. Scotland's a more interesting case. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there is a second referendum, and if that referendum is actually for Scottish independence, unlike the last one. Now, what would the implications be for UK security? Well, I think there are a couple, the most important one being about the nuclear submarine base, which the SNP has basically, if you read their manifesto, for example, and this is nothing new, it's been sort of a pledge for a very long time, that they would want to see a nuclear-free Scotland, which then has all sorts of implications for NATO and sort of where the UK puts its submarines in the future and so forth, which would have to be negotiated and new bases built, and of course that adds to the expense and the complications of it all. As far as Scottish soldiers now serving in the British Army, I suspect that they probably would still remain in the British Army. I mean, for one thing, the Scottish regiments are actually sort of traditionally run by English officers. So at least in terms of the officer corps, I think they'd be fairly secure. But as far as the soldiers themselves are concerned, I can't imagine that the Scottish government is going to get its act together on defense anytime soon. So therefore, all these soldiers are going to be looking for work, and they'll probably just remain employed by the British Army. So there'll be issues about bases and that sort of thing. And then, of course, on top of that, you have border issues that'll have to be worked out. And so it'll be a huge mess. I don't think it's in Scotland's interest to leave, regardless of the EU, what happens with leaving or not. And likewise, even before, during the last vote, I couldn't see any logic behind the Scotland leaving. I think it goes back to Greg's point earlier that this is a lot more about emotion than reason. And in that respect, in the last couple of years, since the Scottish referendum, and especially with the prospect of the UK leaving, I wouldn't be surprised at all if this issue comes back to haunt us.
Okay, Julian?
So my question is for Jeffrey Michaels. Jeffrey, my question is about the perspective on British-Russian relations, because on the one hand, we all know that at least in the last 2 years, UK adopted the most drastic attitude on Russia, and all remember how much they pushed, for instance, at the beginning of 2018, for the Western capitals to adopt a very radical attitude on Russian intelligence officers, and the fact that the West has been able to expel almost 140 Russian diplomats, living or working in Western capitals. It was due to the British pressures. On the other hand, I see already articles in the British press, like Gideon Rachman a few weeks ago, trying to say that the relations between Russia and UK and Russia were not always, confrontational ones. And Gideon, invoked historical reasons for Russia and the Brits, to cooperate closely, like against the war against Napoleon, or of course the Second World War. So my question: you are in a very privileged position, to see, to analyze what's going on in the British foreign policy. How do you see the perspective of relations between the UK and Russia, especially taking consideration that the Brexit will succeed and UK will leave the European Union,
just a few points to raise. I thought the reaction to the Skripal assassination attempt in 2018 is very interesting. Was a very interesting case, at least the UK's reaction to it. I think, if you recall back at the time, it was actually that the UK was not doing very much at all, that it took them months before they actually took any action. Now, partly that might have been because they were trying to build a wider coalition, but actually that they didn't take any action within, say, a week or something like this was quite remarkable, I thought. And I think Theresa May took a lot of, came under a lot of pressure at the time, especially internally, to do something, to show some sort of action. But again, this is one of the problems you saw, even if you go back as far as the Litvinenko assassination back in 2006, that the UK government doesn't really have a good policy about how to deal with these sorts of situations. Do they make these issues public? Do they retaliate by kicking out Russian SVR officers in Moscow, in London, and so on and so forth? One of the more amusing things actually that came as a result of the Skripal assassination was the Russian narrative. If you recall, the Russian ambassador in London made it seem like it was Theresa May's great plot against Russia, that this was some sort of Theresa May plot, which was probably the most unbelievable narrative one could actually expect. As far as future UK-Russia relations are concerned, within the bureaucracy, so within the armed forces, the security services, the intelligence services, and so forth, there's been a very strong anti-Russia bias for a very long time. There's nothing new to that. In fact, in many respects, I saw them as being almost more anti-Russian than the Americans, which surprised me. On the other hand, the real danger is actually at the highest level of the government, which is the political establishment, and especially within the Conservative Party. And again, there was nothing terribly new about what happened. It was just mentioned before, Boris Johnson and Brexit and so forth. These issues go back some years. I remember being talked about certainly back in, say, 2007, 2008. This was a major concern, that the Russians were putting a lot of money into the Tory party, at least some of the candidates in particular. I think the more worrying trend, to be brutally frank, and something that needs to be looked out for, what was mentioned just a few moments ago was this notion of Lisbon to Vladivostok. A much more worrying trend is Washington to Vladivostok. I think that is something that's, it's something that we need to look out for very, very carefully. I was absolutely shocked, totally shocked, just the other day, reading a Voice of America news story that dealt with polls about U.S. views of Russia. And something that I found quite extraordinary was the family members of U.S. Armed Service members, you saw this, 49% approval, or at least have a favorable opinion of Russia. Even within the broader population, you have a massive increase from, I think it was 18% to 28% or 29% favorable, viewing Russia as an ally. This is quite extraordinary. And I fear that, I think to some extent, since with the U.S. election being an issue for the Republican Party, they've had to not be quite as pro-Russia, at least as openly pro-Russia as they might otherwise be. This whole issue about Trump's statement, for example, which on one hand could just be a reaction, sort of, this is what Macron said, so I have to say something different, but actually it was probably pre-election statement basically saying that I'm not Russia's puppet or something like this. I believe in a strong NATO, and using that as a soundbite after the election. If he gets in, if he's reelected, that's the real worry, and that's going to affect everything. So in that sense, the role of the UK in relation to that is going to be quite minimal. It scares the hell out of me personally, but I think it's something that needs to be taken quite seriously and more attention paid to it.
Good afternoon. My name is Marius Păunescu. I am an associate professor in National Defense University Carol I. A question related to Brexit and NATO-EU relations. We know that the UK is a key state that make the relation between NATO and EU from the perspective of US interest in European Union activities. Knowing the fact that maybe the Brexit will win and the UK will be very happy with its sovereignty, I think inside of European Union, the other countries will run to take the position of UK as was before Brexit. And my question is related to all those that are interested to speak here. Who do you think, or what countries do you think that are prepared to take the position of UK in this relation between US and European Union? And also if it is the case of Romania to take this role, because we have some arguments in this favor. Thank you very much.
Very good question.
I will take this because I already wrote about this, and I suppose that Mr. Păunescu is referring to that. Yeah, I was implying the fact that Romania and Poland combined together in a type of convergence of the whole policies inside European Union, which, by the way, we know it's not the case. If we have a convergence related to what's happened in the eastern flank, the relationship towards EU is completely different, if not completely opposed. Yes, Romania and Poland, including for the votes, could have a type of balancing position, and it will also reflect with high legitimacy the presence in those debates, in those decisions of a 2+2 to Western Europeans, to Eastern Europeans, to old and new Europe, if I want to go for the other type of. But once again, is just a reflection and a possibility in very clear conditions that we are not facing nowadays. And the strategic weight of Poland, even combined with Romania altogether in any type of conundrum that we can figure out, is far, far from what Great Britain can offer in terms of cohesion and balancing between France and Germany.
Good afternoon. First of all, congratulations for this conference, to all of you for presentations. I'm former diplomat. My name is Peter Rakanen, and I would like to speak from the citizen point of view, from civil organizations. One question only. You answered already where we are. Where we are, Romania, because we are here to hear what happened with Brexit, but in connection with our country, because we are interested of Romania. During the history, we, Romania, we were being accused of a lot of things being in the middle, on the right, on the left, that we played wrong, and so on. Now, I should tell you something. I'm living in Germany since many years, 30 years. And I will start from here, and I will ask you to give an answer, if you can, of course. Today, I became more confused as I came here. Even the conference was perfect. Because you have different point of view, but yes, normal, of course, but we like citizens, we are not clear where Romania is in this game. You answer now, thank you. It will be, I will be proud to be like that, as Mr. Kivu said in the last word. But I'm remembering what one of my friends from the German government told me 25 years ago, coming in Romania, very good friend. He said, Peter, we are building EU not for you, for Romania, for us. Take care of that and keep in your mind. It was on the right hand of Mr. Kohl and Mitterrand that time, because they did, or they forced EU. We know all of us very well that we were not prepared to coming in Europe from many points of view. And you are always forced to take some decision. Mr. General, very nice explain that we are between sovereignty, prosperity, defense, security, and then our colleague, Mr. Boleshoiu, explained a little bit by figures where we are, how much we are losing in percentage. Now, from these points of view, sovereignty, prosperity, security, which we are sure now because of NATO, of course, and the other one to remain on these games of others, because there are 3, 4 groups now. EU, Asia, China comes. They are not sleeping. France separate from Germany now. I heard just now to you. UK with America. The question is, from your point of view, in order to go from here more clear, because I am no specialist in such things like you, how is better for Romania to do it? I am asking the British people first, because they brought us in these things now, and then our general, if he wants to answer me. How is better for Romania? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an important question. Thank you. Domnul Medar, vreți să spuneți?
Thank you.
For Romania, what is better? It's to keep the way that Romania has today. In this order, three points, 3 targets. First of all, to be a reliable partner of our strategic partner, which is the United States. The second, to keep us the position that we have now in NATO, because we are considered serious partners. We have been in all operational field when NATO has been in the last years. And the third one, to have a good and excellent connection with the European Union. It means that for us up to now, in the, let's say, open minds of the people, there was not the question about prosperity and sovereignty. Always we succeeded to keep a balance up to now, and I hope this will continue. With Russia and China, it's honestly difficult to say because, and I will give you the answer, because if you ask me this question last year, I would have another position. But Russia and China, and I'll give you an example, this month signed and opened the tap for a new pipeline of gas from Russia to China, and in the same day, China sent to Washington a letter that they will apply sanctions to the United States because of the relations that we have now. In the same day. And this can say something more. Just today I've read some papers, of course coming from a Chinese source, that they are saying that in 10, 12 years they can discuss about an alliance between Russia and China. And we have to be very careful about this kind of relations, what it means for the world, but some things happened during these days, just right these days.
Okay.
Julian Maras, journalist. Brief question regarding the status of London as world's #1 financial hub, which to some extent can be regarded as a significant dimension of the British overall concept of defense. As you well know, there has been a lot of debate in the past few years whether or not London will be able to keep this status or not after Brexit. Therefore, I would like to ask you, to your knowledge, are there any contingency plans for keeping London as it is today or not, in terms of, I've told you, financial hub? Thank you.
I apologize if for the previous question, Jeffrey wanted to say anything, or Mr. Kifu, or any of the panelists.
I'm afraid I don't have very much to add to the
Okay.
I would just add something about the Russia-China issue. And I'd say the Russia-China issue today is a product of this transforming global order from a unipolar to a multipolar, and especially the US-led reaction to try and halt the relative decline of its global hegemony, which, excuse the expression, has been a clusterfuck. Because the main point is, historically, Russia and China are not allies, they're enemies. And everything the West has done has pushed them together. Under these circumstances, I mean, it's the most idiotic thing I've seen. They've done everything to bring about the alliance, and it'll probably happen. And especially now when you see these Azov members all of a sudden turn up in Hong Kong. I mean, what's that going to tell the Chinese? I mean, it speaks volumes. So, I mean, this has been self-inflicted.
Although one world, the differences are still high. There are a lot of places in the world where they are clashing. And we have also to keep in mind that not only Central Asia, where there's really, how should I put it, maybe not still competition, not direct conflict, but in Africa, in a lot of places, it's already a race for who's getting first. Chinese with their own instruments, with their own presence, and the Russian private military companies taking over only the goodies from what's on the ground. So an alliance, any type of format of convergence between Russia and China in the mid to long term, besides big events and big statements, our strategic partners, and it's not quite likely to happen even in the next 10 years. It's my approach.
Okay, we are coming towards the end of our conference. We have time for one or two more questions. Mr. Mureșan and Mr. Dobrovie. Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
Parliament first.
Yeah, no, Mr. Mureșan, please. You're.
Yeah, very kind. Thank you so much. Regarding relations Russia and China, they are now quite close, thanks to the sanctions applied in the last years. They, on mid and long term, they could not cooperate. They are obliged, they are condemned to cooperate in big projects because of the territory, population, resources, and strategic visions. So, Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. So, in general, where China is investing, Russia avoid to clash with the interest. Also, if Russia invests somewhere, China take care on this interest. There are two partners, but we have to look and to exploit this situation. So, in this very moment, because it was a question where Romania is, it's in a very complicated situation, but also it's a moment in which we can reinvent our foreign policy. Yes, I fully agree that we are linked with the strategic partner, United States. We have the results of membership in NATO, we have the results of membership in European Union due to this close relation with the United States. But in the same time, to the three arguments you presented, I have to add that if US is one pillar, a strategical one, I think we have to recognize that China is the other pillar, traditional, potential, and in the future development is world power number one, 2035, 2049, and so on. We are full members of the family of European Union. We have to discover that one is a message from EU to China or to Russia, and others are the bilateral relations, Germany, China, France, China, Italy, China, and so on. So, full members of European Union, and we have to discover that we are in a moment to have normal relations with Russia. So, to discover this complexity of the situation, very tense international environment, but an opportunity to reinvent. Each country, it's in the moment of reinventing the foreign policy. It's a big chance for Romania, with a heritage of the bilateral relations with China and recognition from China of our contribution for supporting China in United Nations, for US, China through Romanian contribution and so on. So it's a big chance now, and the young generation, our parliamentarians, could have a contribution in this very special moment. Thank you so much, my dear colleague.
Thank you. I would also like to make some comments. Firstly, I would very much doubt that this new alliance between Russia and China is of some other nature than an opportunistic one, because Russia and China have divergent interests. For example, if you consider Siberia and other spaces, so I don't think that on the long term Russia has the interest to become a junior ally of a construction with China. That is very much what is happening now. If we consider the economical point of view, the point of view of the armies of the two countries, the modernization capabilities of the two countries, and so on. That is one short comment. In my view, Russia would have, if they would understand their own interest, more interest to come closer to Europe, so to counterbalance China in the long term. But that is another issue. Coming back to the Brexit issue, I would have a very short question for our British friends. What do they see as the very likely scenario in the developments of Brexit if the January deadline is not met? What is happening afterwards? And from your perspective, and coming back to Romania, if you do see the possibility of Romania taking advantage of, in a certain way, of Brexit, even if it is a cynical question in a way, but if Romania can play a role, given that it has good relations also with Germany, France on the one side, with United States on the other side, and also with Great Britain trying to make maybe a bilateral relation stronger. So this would be some questions, and thank you very much for interesting debates.
Sorry,
Thank you. Yep, please.
Before I answer that question, can I actually ask the gentleman with the red tie, could you repeat the question that you asked earlier, because I don't think we got to it, but I didn't hear the first part anyway. So
I can rephrase it. Do you think Brexit will affect London's position of being world's #1 financial hub?
It depends on the markets.
Excuse me, please, speaking about this question of you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Now, as my colleague from the panel said, it's a multilateral world. My opinion is not a multilateral world. It's a superlateral world, because the interests of the company, of big companies, sometimes they are reacted like states, or can influence the position of the states. You can see many presidents that are traveling, visiting other countries just to support the commercial area. The world, it's not unipolar in the financial point of view. It's very difficult to say about London, about New York, about Taipei, about Doha. All of these, they are very important financial poles. That's the only thing that I wanted to add it to you.
On that question, I'm afraid I have nothing really to add. I'm not an economist, much less an expert in the financial services industry. From what I've heard, it's going to be a lot less of an impact than is probably attributed to it. I don't think a lot of large firms, for example, are going to be just rushing off to Frankfurt or something like this on a dime. I think that's probably been overstated, to say the least. On Russia-China, just a couple of things. I mean, I was at a conference last week, and this issue of Russia-China relations came up. And this whole problem of, well, you're not dealing with an equal partnership. There's one that's greater than the other. One's a greater power, the other's a lesser power. The problem is that the Russians don't know, the Russians won't concede to the fact that they're the lesser power and insist on being the greater power, and the same as the reverse is the same for the Chinese. You know, and if you go back in history, this whole issue of, you know, why there were ruptures in the relationship, not just over communist ideology, for example, but if you go back to, say, the first the Kimoy-Matsu crisis in the 1950s, and this was an issue that Khrushchev didn't like the idea that Mao was going to start a war with the Americans, that he was going to get involved in as a result, and sort of one bad thing led to the next and to the next. So, I mean, you know, these things seem, you know, the relationship seems somewhat close at the moment, but it's not terribly close, and again, it's one of these things that can turn on a dime very, very quickly.
Okay.
Related to the question on London Financial City. Well, as I told you, up to 80% of the GDP stands for services. And one big chunk of this 80% is financial services. Of course, I think we will see a decrease. For example, just a couple of months ago, Deutsche Bank and UniCredit decided to relocate, to close part of their swap derivative contracts from London and move them to where you know, to Frankfurt. So we've seen, and all the analysis suggests a decrease in GDP, and of course this is going to be reflected also here. But I think we should not talk about a collapse at all. But maybe a decent decrease we will see in this type of transactions.
Sorry, just on the last point about potential partnerships or new options that the UK might have afterwards in relation to Romania and Poland, if I understand the question correctly. Yes, I mean, I think there's no question whatsoever that the UK will take advantage of any opportunity to extend its relations, especially if it's, shall we say, not very expensive relationship from its perspective. If it doesn't have to commit a lot, then it'll take advantage of every relationship that it can have. And I think for the most part, I would say already, certainly in terms of relations with the Poles and the Romanians, from what I've seen, just personally, the relations are quite close. And I think in that sense, whether they will leverage Romania and Poland with respect to the EU, I'm sure they would love that, just as the Americans would in that sense. But at the same time, and this is why I'm always amused more than anything else about a lot of this discourse about the European army. I think this is utter nonsense. As certainly not as constituting any sort of threat to the UK or you know, as an alternative to the US or something like this. I mean, effectively, when you drill down to it, what you're actually talking about is effectively a strategic headquarters, which is just a place to put a lot of staff officers who have nothing else to do. This has very little about any new capability of any substance. I mean, again, if you look at the debates as they've emerged, you know, as they've evolved, certainly since the 1990s, when we're talking about things like the headline goal to battle groups that don't actually go anywhere, and so forth. I mean, this is the real issue that we're all dancing around and don't want to actually address. But I think that whether or not you have another headquarters or something like this is totally irrelevant and beside the point.
What about this scenario after January, if the January deadline is not met? What is the question about? What is happening there? What evolvings you see?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, just on that. I mean, I would have to say, and this is where I keep coming back to the Kafka's indefinite postponement. It'll just be another postponement for maybe 6 months or something like this, however long they choose. And if that doesn't work, another 6 months. The saga will go on. But I don't see any resolution to this anytime soon. If it's a matter of course, if it's a matter of that. And again, this will be affected by the dynamics of the coalition and what happens tomorrow, and so forth. Whether it's relatively quick or just prolonged agony.
Domnul Fota, ați cerut un ultim cuvânt.
I'll be very brief. You know, this year I met 3 different Chinese delegations, and from all of them I got the same answer. China do not trust the idea of alliance. The Chinese believe that the concept of alliance is a Western concept. It is usual for Europe and for the West due to the political fragmentation, which is quite long, historically speaking. But when it comes to China, China never had allies in the past because it was always a great country, and when it was weak, it was under exploitation. So it made no sense for China to look for allies, and they don't trust the idea of an alliance. They believe that in an alliance, somebody should lead the others, and China will never accept anybody else to lead against China. So basically, I think that in Romania, and not only Romania, in Europe, we are over-exaggerating this discussion on Russian-Chinese. I understand why either the Russians or some Americans are interested, in putting some pressures. The Americans, they want to put some pressure on the Europeans, and the Russians, they want to put some pressure on some of the Americans. But when it comes to China, the Chinese are not looking for allies. They will have a very good relationship with Russia. Probably the cooperation will increase, but I think that we are far, for very clear historical reasons, far from a Russian-Chinese alliance, which in a way gives us an opportunity, gives us in the West an opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, I would like every panelist to say a concentrated final sentence, final thought, really concentrated. What is your takeaway from today's conference? 1 or 2 sentences, please, on the what you think we should take away as an essence of today's discussions. Thank you.
So 1 or 2 sentences. Brexit is not going to end anytime soon. It's like you say, it's going to be like Groundhog Day. Relive the moment. For how long we shall see. But its main effect is to split British society. For how long this remains, there are a lot of unknowns in this, and these will become known with time. And I think the main point is to get this down from an emotional plane to a more rational plane and reasoned plane, if there is to be any movement out of the current quagmire.
Thank you.
I would like to say some words about what Romania should do. My opinion is that we have to start from now at the lower level the planning about bilateral relations with the United Kingdom and to develop as much as possible these bilateral relations, but at the same time to keep the track with the European Union.
Narcis?
I think from an economic perspective, I'd like you to remain with the idea that nothing truly dramatic is going to happen, and I think both parts will have the ability to metabolize, let's say, the outcome, and I think we will have sooner or later some sort of a deal.
Well, we are in the year 2259 when a group of British parliamentarians are coming to London, as they are doing every 2 or 3 years, to prolong their Brexit. Nobody remembers where it comes from, but it's a tradition, and everybody is filming and making photos of that event every 2 or 3 years. No, is just a joke. It's not going it's eventually going to be finished this year, but I will remind you not only the 31st of January, which is already in there, but the 31st of December, which will be the final deadline for the new agreement of UK out of the EU together with the EU, with a possibility of postpone this for 2 years, but with a financial contribution to the new budget 2021-2027, and with a lot of headaches if it happens. Prolongation is most credible after the 31st of January, if there's not a very clear majority, which seems not to be the case, for the Brexit agreement of Mr. Johnson. Any type of referenda, any type of renegotiation with laborers, maintaining Great Britain in the common market or in any type of other form is going to take time, and it's going to harm more and more Great Britain and, for that matter, EU as well. Thank you.
Just 2 brief points. The first one, just to reiterate what Greg mentioned before, which is this problem of the long-term effects on British society, certainly British politics, of this Brexit debate of the Brexit issue, which is not going away anytime soon. And the second point is, as far as implications for defense, especially UK defense, I don't see it constituting a major issue. I mean, even in relation to whether the UK cooperates with the EU in the future on various EU missions, I don't think this is going to be a problem. To the extent that there has been any discussion, is basically around whether this office has relations with that office and so forth, so very much a technocratic argument. But I think where it counts and when it counts, the British will be there beside the EU. Should an issue actually rise to that level of interest, they will most certainly be there.
My conclusion is that such a conference could easily have taken place in London, with the level of speakers and I think the level of enthusiasm and the level of questions that were strategically asked. So I thank both the panelists and the audience involved, and I'm very happy we have been able to attract such level of interest for our international and security conferences, which for the past 3 years are already becoming a tradition, and I think they're well established and well settled. For next year, our NGO has another 2 security conferences planned, one of which will probably be on the subject of fake news in the first part of the year. We're also planning conferences that are more national on energy and education. These are our other interesting topics. I would like to encourage you, if you had a good experience today, to rate us on Facebook. We would like to keep our 5-star rating, which has been the norm so far. And we certainly also encourage you to look at the to look at the website, because you are going to see at least 2 important things that we are doing outside of these security conferences. So we are going to see the fact that we are actually giving a scholarship for students who are in 10th grade that want to go to the United Kingdom. We have 9 scholarships that we're going to be awarding in February. So if you have any bright ideas about students that are fitting this criteria, let us know. The deadline will be on the 25th of January for their files. We have been very lucky to have Romanians and the UK participate in this way, because the top colleges in the United Kingdom are receiving Romanian scholars in this way, and it's a very tangible way to cooperate. I would also highlight the fact that we are running several trainings for EU funds, for local public administration, for active citizenship, and a bunch of other classes like leadership or public policy in education. So thank you very much for today's contribution. And I'm now inviting you, if you still have a few moments, there will be catering outside and the usual canapes. You can still enjoy some bilateral discussions. Thank you very much.